Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we followed Gustavus Adolphus' widow, Maria Eleonora, and her attempts to stay relevant, not to be shoved to the side by the Regency government ruling in the name of her underage daughter, Christina. Maria Eleonora failed in her attempts and was denied the money she wanted and in the end even access to her own daughter. The government worried that the Dowager Queen would pass on her animosity towards Sweden and the government to Christina. In the end, Maria Eleonora chose to escape to her native Brandenburg with the help of a Danish diplomat. She didn't return to Sweden until Christina was an adult and ruled in her own right. Today, we'll take a look at Christina's reign and see whether Maria Eleonora actually succeeded in infusing her daughter with some of that disdain for Sweden that the Dowager was so famous for. Episode 95, The Apostate. As queen, the young Christina displayed great skill at playing the political game. We saw that already last time, when she managed to gently push the Council of the Realm to accept that her mother, Dowager Queen Maria Eleonora, be invited back to Sweden. During her reign, she displayed this skill on more than one occasion, setting nobles against the other estates to get her way, but at the same time remaining the best of friends to the nobility. Not an easy thing to accomplish. Just ask Christian IV of Denmark. The country Christina took over in December 1644 was radically different from the one her father had governed a generation before. I've already mentioned on a couple of occasions how the money and loot brought to Sweden during the country's recent wars had led to a booming construction work, as well as a general upgrade of Swedish art, music, and scholarship. Nowhere was this more obvious than at Christina's court. The previous Vasa monarchs had presided over a court that was modest, provincial even, far removed both geographically and mentally from the splendid opulence of its continental counterparts. An illuminating example is that when Gustavus Adolphus was a child, his mother, the queen, had personally measured out thread if a member of the court needed to mend their clothes. That kind of penny pinching was now long gone. When Christina turned 18, the court expenses were 3% of the annual budget. 10 years later, it had ballooned to 12%. But it wasn't like frugality had been replaced by frivolity. Sweden was a major European power now, and the people at the top needed to play the part. Remember, only power that looked like power was power. In addition to the building boom in Stockholm, the inhabitants of the upgraded city could also enjoy a wide variety of public spectacles and other forms of entertainment. A hitherto unseen number of processions, banquets, balls, plays, and fireworks took place in the Swedish capital, all done to impress and to imitate court life elsewhere, especially in France, the gold standard of power looking like power in the 17th century Europe. As I mentioned last time, Gustavus Adolphus' wife, Maria Eleonora, had started this trend, but her daughter Christina took it to a whole new level. For instance, when Charles I, the King of England, lost the Civil War and his head, several of his favorite court artists moved to Sweden to seek patronage from Queen Christina instead. Christina invited not only artists, but also philosophers and other great minds to visit Stockholm in order to spread some of their light over the dark northern edge of European civilization where she was queen. Some of them were given teaching positions at Uppsala University, but that didn't always turn out the way Christina had hoped. The continental professors were usually not particularly impressed with the rather provincial academy and its students, whose educational horizon tended to be quite narrow. When one professor from Strasbourg, who was supposed to teach Roman rhetoric, gave voice to his disappointment, his students did not appreciate his rhetorical flair or effective messaging. Instead, they beat him up and then gathered at his house and threw rocks at it. The most famous example of Christina's invited brilliant minds is the French philosopher René Descartes. You know, the guy who coined the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." He'd heard about the learned Queen of Sweden, dubbed the Nordic Minerva by sycophantic admirers, and he accepted an invitation to come visit. Descartes arrived at the end of 1649, expecting to be greeted and feted like the cerebral celebrity that he was. But upon his arrival in Stockholm, he wasn't even allowed to see the Queen. Instead, he was installed in a room at the castle and instructed to write a ballet, and perhaps also a comedic play. The great philosopher probably felt a little offended that the queen seemed to ignore him, but it was still preferable to what was to come, because when Christina finally decided to summon him, he was to attend her 3 times a week at 5 in the morning, because that's apparently when the Nordic Minerva was in the mood to discuss philosophy. In his letters home, Descartes conceded that the queen was both well-educated and had an impressive grasp of the French language, but he didn't think she was sufficiently interested in his theories. He also complained about general boredom and the cold. The Swedish winter did not agree with the French philosopher, especially not at 5 in the morning. In the end, he didn't have to suffer the early mornings and the bitter cold for too long. Unfortunately for Descartes, the reason for that was that he caught pneumonia and died in February 1650, only a few months after his arrival in Sweden. Not every one of Christina's guests were that unlucky, though. Many of the philosophers and artists who visited may have been disappointed by what they found in Sweden, but at least they were usually rewarded handsomely. They left with full pockets and could advance their careers in better climes thanks to glowing recommendations from a queen. It should be noted, though, that not every foreigner who gathered at Christina's court had a brilliant mind. Corfitz Ulfeldt, remember him, one of Christian IV's sons-in-law? He was the thoroughly corrupt steward of the realm who denied Vibeke Kruse access to the king as he lay dying, and then led the attacks on her and her children after the king's death. It only took a few years for him to run afoul of the new king of Denmark, his brother-in-law Frederick III, whom he had tried to outmaneuver in the struggle for the crown. So Corfitz and his wife sought refuge at Christina's court. Already last time I talked about how Christina differed from most other women of her day due to the fact that she was given a solid education. This was something usually reserved for boys from the uppermost echelons of society, but since Gustavus Adolphus had wanted her to be able to take over the reins of the kingdom if the need would arise, he made sure she was educated like a little prince. She was introduced to a world of knowledge and physical activity where she was the only female. The other women and girls of the court were supposed to limit themselves to conversation, etiquette, fashion, and entertainment. That meant that already at an early age, a gap opened up between the young queen and other women. With time, this gap widened into a deep and wide abyss. The adult Christina couldn't stand female interests and preoccupations, and she would cast doubt on the intellectual and physical capabilities of women. Other women, that is. To mark her distance from the world of women, she looked and dressed differently from other women of her time and class. Throughout the ages, women in higher circles have signaled that they led lives of leisure through their impractical and oftentimes restricting way of dressing. 17th century Sweden was no exception. Christina's female contemporaries wore shoes with high red heels, wide dresses with lots of fabric, tight corsets, and intricate hairdos. They made sure that their skin was as pale as possible, both by staying out of direct sunlight and by applying makeup. Christina had no time for any of that. She preferred flat shoes, a practical dress with a sensible skirt, and a top that didn't expose too much skin. Definitely no bare shoulders or any cleavage. Her hair usually wasn't coiffed, and instead it was simply held in place with a comb or a ribbon. She was also unusually tanned for a woman of her standing, since she didn't shield herself from the sun and enjoyed spending time outdoors. She had been taught to fence and shoot well, and she was also an accomplished horseback rider. In addition, her manners differed from the feminine norm of her day. Simply put, she walked and talked like a man. She peppered her speech with curses, she slept as little as possible, and she ate simple food, avoiding the culinary excesses that were common and popular among those who could afford it. But as much as Queen Christina looked down upon women and questioned their abilities, she couldn't escape the fact that she herself was very much a woman. It's not exactly shocking that this must have messed with her head a little. Sometimes she almost gives the impression of a neurotic overachiever who tries desperately to prove her worth despite her sex. Beyond all the dresses and the makeup and the pleasant conversation that Christina loathed so, there was one thing a woman in the 1600s was supposed to do that she really wasn't interested in doing. And that was getting married. Now, had she been any other woman, commoner or noble, of modest means or fabulously wealthy, that would have been a private matter, or at least one for her family. But she was the queen. Her marrying and producing an heir was a matter of state. The stability of the realm and the continuity of her dynasty hung in the balance. If she didn't marry and have a child, preferably a son, the Swedish branch of the Vasa dynasty would die with her, and God knows what the Polish Vasas would get up to then. When the Riksdag agreed to grant her the right to succeed to the throne back in 1604, they assumed that she would marry and secure the continuation of the royal line. Already back then, her father, Gustavus Adolphus, had been thinking about her future husband, and he'd initiated negotiations with Brandenburg for Christina to marry her first cousin, Frederick William, the man we met last time when he, as Elector of Brandenburg, really didn't want his aunt Maria Eleonora, Dowager Queen of Sweden, to return home. After Gustavus Adolphus' death, said Maria Eleonora had been entertaining the idea of marrying off her daughter to a Danish prince, something Christian IV had been keen on, but the Regency government obviously was dead set against. When Christina reached the age of 18 and started her reign for real, she was still unmarried, and there was no obvious candidate waiting in the wings. If no suitable foreign prince could be found, there was a domestic option though. Her first cousin, Carl Gustav, the son of Catherine Vasa, Gustavus Adolphus' sister, and the German John Casimir, Count Palatine. If the name Catherine Vasa sounds familiar, that's because she's the one who took over as Christina's heirs's mother when Maria Eleonora was packed off to Gripsholm Castle by the Regency government. That meant that Christina and Carl Gustav had grown up together and knew each other well. A couple of first cousins and childhood friends. As tempting as that idea must have sounded like, Christina was in no hurry to tie the knot. In addition to any other objections she might have had, she wasn't tempted by the legal implications of a marriage. As long as she was single, she was her own mistress, not to mention queen of a major European power. After her marriage, she'd lose her legal independence and technically be obliged to obey her husband. And back in the mid-17th century, those weren't empty words. A married woman had no standing and few rights independent of her husband. It's not particularly surprising, then, that Christina, a woman brought up to think like a man, drew the conclusion that, if one can belong to oneself, one shouldn't belong to someone else. But she wasn't the only one with an opinion on the matter. When the Queen turned 21, the Riksdag more or less forced her to agree to commit to the idea of marriage. Sort of. She agreed to consider marrying her cousin Carl Gustav, but she stopped short of actually promising anything. This bought Christina a little time, but not much. Instead of getting off her back, people now started to pester her about when she was going to marry her cousin. And by people, I mean the Council of the Realm and the Riksdag, so not just some random members of the general public who she'd be able to ignore. A couple of years later, in 1649, Christina changed her tactic. She didn't really want to marry Carl Gustav, but she also understood that the kingdom needed the stability that a settled succession would bring. So she suggested to the Council of the Realm that Carl Gustav be declared her heir without any marriage. When members of the council asked why she couldn't just marry him and be done with it, she responded, "Her Majesty's eyes and nose are too elevated to yield to the power of a man in the situation she finds herself." In other words, she didn't want a man to tell her what to do. So the Queen and the council were at an impasse. They didn't want to make Carl Gustav her heir without a marriage, whereas Christina was more than willing to make Carl Gustav her heir, but not her husband. The following year, 1650, the Riksdag met again, because it was finally time to crown Christina. She'd been queen in her own right for 5 years by then, and it was about time she received God's, or at least the Church's, official approval of her reign. Christina herself was determined to use the occasion to push through the appointment of Carl Gustav as her heir without having to marry him. She had a plan, and she was going to apply all the diplomatic and political skills that Axel Oxenstierna had taught her. The coronation itself took place in Stockholm on October 20th. As you could expect, it was a grand affair, where all stops were pulled out by the self-conscious and status-hungry Swedish leadership. The kingdom needed to display all its splendor and power, and they did their very best, even though the triumphal arches that were erected weren't made of marble, but wood and painted fabric. By all accounts, the coronation ceremony and all the festivities surrounding it were a great success. But Christina also had to get the Riksdag to agree to her suggestion to appoint her cousin her heir to the throne. And that wasn't going to be easy. The nobility, led by the high-born men in the Council of the Realm, objected to this foreigner, Carl Gustav's father was German after all, becoming first in line to the throne without marrying the queen. But the other estates, especially the peasants, had other concerns. They worried about what they saw as an ongoing aristocratic land grab. In the last few decades, more and more land had been granted to various aristocrats, old families and newly ennobled people who had done favors to the crown, including Christina's tailor. Christina was extremely generous with handing out noble titles. During her time on the throne, the number of noble families in Sweden more than doubled. On average, she ennobled one person every week. Many of these nobles, old and new, were given or allowed to buy crown lands. As a consequence, during Christina's reign, the land owned by the nobility surpassed half all the arable land in the kingdom. Christina handed out so much land so quickly that she couldn't even keep track of it all. In some of the letters patent issued by Christina, she even had to state that this or that nobleman is granted this or that land, unless it's already been given to somebody else. In other words, things were a little out of control. Since noblemen didn't pay taxes on their land, the tax base was getting smaller and smaller at an alarming rate. And at the same time, the crown's expenses weren't being reduced. On the contrary, they grew dramatically. These increased expenses had to be covered by taxes raised from less and less land than before. It's not exactly shocking that the remaining taxpayers weren't particularly happy about this situation. Now they asked the queen to stop this development and even reclaim some land granted to nobles so that it could once again be taxed as crown land. Alternatively, they demanded that the nobility also start to pay taxes. The second alternative scared some nobles enough to support the idea of the crown reducing the amount of land in aristocratic hands. Christina had no plans to actually stop favoring the nobility in this way, but she did recognize that this was a golden opportunity for her to twist the nobility's arms a little. So she met with the representatives from the peasant estate and listened sympathetically to their complaints and concerns. She promised to take their suggestions under serious consideration. This had the members of the noble estate shaking in their boots. So they were mighty relieved when the queen met with them and promised she wouldn't grant the peasants' requests after all, as long as the nobles would vote in favor of making Carl Gustav heir to the throne. Christina had the noblemen exactly where she wanted. Stuck between the threat of smaller personal incomes or accepting Carl Gustav as their next king, they chose the latter. On the last day of the Riksdag, November 6, 1650, Carl Gustav of the House Palatinate Zweibrücken was declared Christina's heir, unless, of course, she'd decide to marry someone else and have children with him. Both the nobles and the peasants went home from the dissolved Riksdag unhappy about the outcome. The peasants hadn't managed to stop the reduction of the tax base, and the nobles had been forced to accept Carl Gustav as heir. The only one who was happy with the result was the queen, and Carl Gustav, of course, even though the Council of the Realm almost immediately started to nag the bachelor heir about the necessity of getting married and having a son as soon as possible. Christina had now achieved everything she wanted. She had settled the issue of the succession, and she hadn't been forced to marry. You'd think she'd now settled into a life of culture and interesting conversations with brilliant minds who continued to flock to her court. But you'd be wrong. She wasn't happy. Already the year after the coronation, she dropped a bombshell among the Council of the Realm when she announced that she wanted to abdicate. She didn't want to be queen anymore. The council members were in shock. They had not seen this coming. When they asked her why she wanted to give up the crown, Christina said she'd reached the conclusion that women shouldn't be allowed to rule. Even though she didn't include herself when she dismissed the intellectual capabilities of women, she pointed out that she couldn't fulfill the military role that was expected of a monarch. She couldn't lead troops in battle like her father had done. To us, this might seem like a ridiculous excuse, but the council took it seriously. Sweden was still involved in a war on the continent, and there was no reason to believe this would change anytime soon. Still, Axel Oxenstierna and the other council members managed to convince Christina to stay on as queen, at least for the time being. But they had only managed to postpone the inevitable. She brought up the topic again and again until they finally relented. If she really didn't want to be queen anymore, they couldn't force her. In 1654, a new Riksdag gathered, this time in Uppsala, north of Stockholm. Here, Christina would renounce the throne, abdicate, and her cousin and successor Carl Gustav be crowned king, all in one go, to make the process as brief as possible and to minimize the potential for instability, uncertainty, and foreign intervention. June 6, 1654, exactly 131 years to the day after her great-grandfather Gustav Vasa had been elected king and founded the Vasa dynasty, Christina ended it by abdicating. It was a long day that started early. Already around 6 o'clock in the morning, the hall of state at Uppsala Castle was packed with people, primarily the members of the four estates who had gathered for the Riksdag, but also members of the court and an assortment of other prominent guests. They were there to witness the end of Christina's reign. At the front of the hall there was a dais, and on top of it stood an ornate throne made of silver. Christina herself had commissioned this impressive piece of over-the-top furniture, and even though it was enormously expensive, it has arguably turned out to be a good investment, because it's still in use today for royal ceremonies, almost 400 years later. Anyway, the guests had plenty of time to admire the silver throne, because the soon-to-be ex-queen Christina didn't arrive until 9 o'clock. She entered the room decked out in all the regalia of state, wearing the crown and holding the scepter and the orb. She ascended the dais and sat down on the throne. Carl Gustav, dressed in somber black, took a seat at the bottom of the dais, and the 32 members of the Council of the Realm stood nearby. At this point, Axel Oxenstierna was supposed to step up and read the official act of abdication, but he didn't move. He had been powerless to stop her from stepping down, but in a silent protest against Christina's decision, her elderly teacher, mentor, and chancellor refused to participate in making it happen. Instead, a more junior council member had to read the document that freed Christina's subjects from all oaths of loyalty to her and transferred the kingdom to her cousin, Carl Gustav. After that, the more senior council members stepped up to strip her of the regalia, taking away the scepter, the orb, and the crown. Then she left the hall and withdrew to her private rooms at the castle. That same afternoon, Christina's cousin was crowned King Carl X Gustav at Uppsala Cathedral. The ceremony was conducted by none other than Bishop John Matthews, Christina's former teacher, whom she'd called Dad. The ex-queen herself declined to make an appearance. This was Carl Gustav's moment. Already the following evening, Christina left Uppsala. She brought with her a lot of baggage. A large part of the splendid library consisting of books Swedish armies had stolen on the continent. She also brought along the royal silverware. The new king didn't mind though. She had left him the silver throne, she could take the silver forks. Even though some had regretted her abdication, few doubted the grounds for her decision. She was, after all, a woman, and Christina was far from the only one who thought that women shouldn't rule. But Christina had another, secret reason for relinquishing the crown, one she couldn't disclose openly to the elderly Axel Oxenstierna or any other council member, or anyone else in the kingdom for that matter. It was a secret so explosive that if it had become public knowledge, she would have been booted off the throne, whether she wanted to step down or not. Queen Christina, the daughter of the Lion from the North, Gustavus Adolphus, who had given his life to protect Protestantism, had decided to become a Catholic. From a young age, Christina had developed not only her intellectual curiosity, but also tolerance, even in religious matters. This was something rare in 17th century Sweden, where strict Orthodox Protestantism was adhered to by everyone, everywhere. To begin with, Christina had been the same. Even though she was open to entertaining various ideas, she had still thought that Catholic dogma was riddled with errors, and that Catholic theologians were wrong wherever they differed from Protestants. But then she had come under the influence of Bishop John Matthews. He'd studied abroad, and in the Netherlands he'd come into contact with proponents of something as exotic as religious tolerance. This shaped his worldview of understanding and a distaste for theological conflicts. He wanted to focus on spirituality, piety, and the things that united all Christians, not the things that divided them. This propensity for peace and tolerance earned John Matthews a lot of enemies in Sweden, not least among the priests, who feared heresy almost as much as they abhorred Catholicism. At the Riksdag in 1644, another bishop attacked him for his dangerous tolerance. That was dangerous, and things could have ended badly for John Matthews, but he had a powerful protector in the Queen. She was furious that her beloved teacher and father figure was under attack, and she let the Council of the Realm know in no uncertain terms that John Matthews was not to be criticized. As long as she was in charge, the bishop was safe. Unfortunately for Matthews, when Christina abdicated, he lost his protector. He was eventually forced to resign as bishop. Anyway, with all due respect for his tolerance and openness, John Matthews was a Protestant priest, and even though he had no desire to fight with Catholics, he still was firmly convinced that they were misguided in their beliefs and practices. Instead, it was the young queen's meeting with practicing flesh and blood Catholics that really changed her opinion about the Roman Church. Thanks to all those foreign intellectuals Christina had invited, she had basically, for the first time in her life, been able to hold open, honest, and in-depth conversations with real-life Catholics, not just the strawman papists that appeared in Protestant propaganda. And it had been an eye-opening experience for the Queen. Already back in 1650, she'd established discreet connections with Jesuit agents who were operating secretly in Sweden. But the person who was most influential in her decision to convert was probably the French ambassador to Sweden. He was not only a true believer, but also someone who had the knowledge and willingness to discuss his faith with the Protestant Queen of Sweden. After a while, he switched from merely discussing religion to actively trying to convince her to convert. In the spring of 1652, 2 years before her abdication, those secret Jesuit agents had sent reports back from Stockholm that the Queen had decided to become a Catholic. Christina was drawn not only to Catholic theology, which was now explained to her by actual Catholics, but also to everything that the Catholic world had to offer. It was all good and well to invite these luminaries to visit, but wouldn't it be so much better to go to them, to immerse herself completely in the arts, sciences, literature and philosophy in France and Italy? Christina had no intention to stay in Sweden after her abdication. That fall, she traveled south through Denmark and northern Germany incognito, dressed like a man. She eventually reached Brussels, and there, on Christmas night 1654, she converted to Catholicism. But she did so in secret. She wasn't ready to make her apostasy public knowledge quite yet. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her decision. No, she was worried, and for good reason, that the Swedish government would deny her the pension she'd been promised when they found out she'd joined the enemy. She stayed in Brussels for a year, but it wasn't her preferred final destination. She wanted to go to Rome. But the papal representatives let her know that access to the Eternal City would be denied as long as she didn't profess her Catholic faith openly and publicly. So Christina lingered while she tried to convince the Swedish government to release the funds they owed her. But after a year, she started to understand that most of the money she'd been promised wasn't forthcoming. So Christina decided to cross her religious Rubicon, to drop the pretense and to move on, literally and figuratively. In the fall that year, Christina left Brussels for Rome. On November 3rd, she made her conversion public in the Austrian city of Innsbruck. After that, the doors to Italy and Rome were open to her. The news spread like wildfire throughout Europe and exploded like a bomb in Stockholm. The daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, a Catholic. Maria Eleonora's escape to the continent faded compared to this scandal. To call it an enormous embarrassment would have been a massive understatement. Axel Oxenstierna and Maria Eleonora would have died of the shock if they hadn't passed away in the months since Christina's abdication. The ex-queen herself continued south and finally reached Rome on December 23rd, where she enjoyed a royal reception by the Pope, for whom she was a considerable propaganda trophy. But the Pope soon learned that the former Queen of Sweden wasn't interested in being a mere propaganda tool, living a quiet life of contemplative piety. No, Christina wasn't more interested in yielding to the men of Rome than to the men of Stockholm. Her big mouth soon ruffled lots of feathers within the higher circles of the church. Already in 1656, Christina decamped for France instead, where she was warmly welcomed at the splendid and less prissy court of the French king. In France, people appreciated not only her excellent French, but also her sharp wit and even sharper tongue. Still, her simple manners and complete lack of female coquettishness did raise a few eyebrows. A leading lady at court, a relative of the king's, noted that Christina most of all resembled a beautiful little boy, or a disheveled gypsy who happened to have fairer skin than expected. During her time in France, Christina tried to convince Cardinal Mazarin that it would be a terrific idea to conquer Naples from Spain and make her queen of this southern Italian kingdom. The French politician listened politely, but in the end nothing came of her plans to win this new crown. Christina's own crown equerry happened to be from Naples, and it turned out that he'd been spying on her and betrayed her plans. When Christina found out, she was furious and had him executed on the spot. This rather rash decision was not appreciated by the French authorities, who pointed out that she had no right to order executions on French soil. People at court were also appalled, and after this incident they refused to socialize with a bloodthirsty ex-queen. To avoid complications, the ostracized Christina returned to Rome. She never did become Queen of Naples, or anything else for that matter. The last 20 years of her life, she continued to follow politics keenly, but she never again played an active role in it. She died in April 1689, and she's one of only a handful of women who have been granted a final resting place in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Meanwhile, back in her old home country, the end of the Vasa dynasty on the Swedish throne had created quite a lot of gossip and drama, but not very much had happened politically. In Denmark, meanwhile, the death of Christian IV and the end of his record-breakingly long reign would prove to be the beginning of a new era in Danish history. Next time, we'll take a closer look at how and why. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.